host for the evening, and that is Dr. Cassandra Pfeifer. She has lived in South Louisiana for the past several years, where she earned her PhD at the University of Louisiana, Lafayette, and she's been teaching for South Louisiana Community College. Her areas of research are American literature, narrative theory, and folklore studies. She will soon be moving to Nebraska, where she'll be teaching at the McCook Community College in the fall. And Cassie, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you, Angela and Sam, for hosting this event and giving me this opportunity to share my love of folklore. It's something I'm very passionate about. And welcome to everybody. I was 30 people. That's a really good turnout, and that's super exciting. So let's get started with memes, monsters, and macaroni salad, exploring folklore in our daily lives. And if you are not from the Midwest and you are thinking macaroni salad, that's a Midwestern thing. So if it was Louisiana, I might have said gumbo. But let's go ahead and get started. As I was thinking about how to best begin this presentation, the question that came to my mind was the idea of universal human experiences. And this is kind of the way that I begin my introduction to folklore classes, because a lot of times I'll get a comment from a student that they don't experience or live any folklore. So this phrase, universal human experiences, do they exist? Which human experiences are universal, if any? It's a question that comes up from time to time, and I did a quick Google search of those terms, and some of the things that came up was, is dying a universal human experience? Is grief a universal human experience? So this idea that, is there anything that all people experience in one form or another? And my initial impulse is to say, well, no, the range of human experience is far too diverse, and the backgrounds and cultures that people come from is just too diverse for that anybody to make that claim. And then I started thinking about it a little bit more, and I thought, I would argue there are two universal human experiences, two things that no matter how long or short your life is, you will have experienced this in one form or another. And those two things are death and folklore. And tonight we are obviously going to be talking about the more cheerful of those two things, called folklore. And so tonight, the questions that I want to address throughout this presentation are, what is folklore? What ways have I experienced folklore throughout my life? What ways have you experienced folklore in your lives? And why is folklore important? Why is this thing, folklore studies, so important to me? And why is it so important or why do I think it should be so important to people in general? Why is it an important subject to know? And throughout this presentation, I might pause from time to time and ask questions, or pause to see if anybody has any input or things that they want to ask or mention. And so don't be afraid to chime in with your thoughts. The best way to go about this, Sam and Angela will be watching the chat and the raise hand feature. So if you want to chime in, make sure that you raise your hand if you want to chime in with your mic. On Apple devices, it should be in the upper right corner. And on PCs, it should be in the lower right corner. So you'll see those three dots, or you look below in the screenshots, and kind of based on what your screen looks like by comparison, you can find the raise hand feature. And Sam or Angela will chime in if you're using the chat and read out what you're saying, or you can unmute yourself and speak using your own voice. But do keep yourself muted throughout the presentation unless you have something to say in one of those moments. So let's carry on. So what is folklore? I've taught introductions of folklore several times now throughout the past few years. And the way that I start the semester is I ask students to have a discussion about what they think folklore is, what their current idea of folklore is. And the most common response that I get, the response that shows up the most is folklore is storytelling. Folklore is ghost stories that they grew up hearing. Folklore is legends about monsters that they grew up hearing. Folklore is fairy tales that they read or that they saw on movies or TV. Cinderella comes up a lot in the responses. So the first thing that I hear in terms of what is folklore is storytelling. And then the second most common thing that I get that students mention at the start of the semester is they will say folklore is the past. They'll mention beliefs of the past or stories that their grandparents told them. So there's those two things that are the most kind of the most repeated ideas of what folklore is at the start of the semester. And then towards the end of the semester, I have my students look back at the beginning of the semester and what they thought folklore was and think about what they know it to be now and kind of reflect on what they've learned throughout the semester about how far folklore's reach truly is. And I had one student who had this to say at the end of the semester. My previous definition of folklore was folklore as it relates to urban legends and folktale books or the legend of Bigfoot. I had not really thought any further about the idea. I now realize that folklore is the thread that holds us together. Folklore is what binds the past to the present. Folklore is in my kitchen every time I prepare a meal from my grandmother and mother's recipe book. Folklore is that Simba stuffed doll that I have had since a kid that now sits against my daughter's pillow. Folklore dwells in the flame of the candle that my brother held at my son's baptism that I keep safe in a box until he has a child of his own. Folklore lives in my memories of my Uncle George's stories of Kushma at family gatherings. Folklore exists in the pocket knife my husband keeps close to his heart that was given to him by his grandfather on his deathbed. Every minute of every day, folklore is evolving, and new folklore is being created. I will never hear the song or see the dance of the Cupid Shuffle or the Tootsie Roll / slide the same. These are also folklore. So as you can see, folklore is deeply personal to us. Folklore is ingrained in our daily lives. So how do we go about figuring out what folklore is without going through a laundry list of examples of folklore? Well, one way to go about doing that is to think about this compound word, folk and lore. So let's start with, who are the folk? Well, Alan Dundas says that the folk are any group of people whatsoever who share at least one common factor. And the response I often hear after that is, well, everybody is the folk. And yes, but everybody is part of folk groups. And not everybody is part of the same folk group. So yes, we are all the folk, but we are all part of different folk groups throughout our lives. So as an example, I identify my regional folk group that I identify as is a Midwesterner. I grew up in Northern Illinois, but I don't identify as part of the Chicago Bears folk group. Instead, I identify as a Minnesota Vikings fan because my dad grew up in Minnesota. And so even though I was born and raised near Chicago Bears country, I was raised to be a Minnesota Vikings fan from when I was a tiny chubby baby in my Vikings pajamas. So I was guided along the way to become part of this folk group, the Minnesota Vikings fandom. And sports groups are a really good way to kind of think about the different types of folk groups that exist and the way in which they interact with each other. So back in 2016, you had the Euro Cup tournament. So the Iceland football team or soccer team returned back home, and they were greeted by their fans, their supporters, in this fashion. And the first time that I saw that, the Iceland football team, they did that after they beat England in one of the matches. And I remember watching that and thinking, that's so cool. I love every bit of it, that the team went down to their side, to their fan side, and they all just organized this slow clap of victory. And then later in that year, it got way cooler for me as a Minnesota Vikings fan when the Minnesota Vikings introduced a new ritual to fans.
We're going to start a new ritual to the beat of the drum. Hands up!
In Iceland, we have the Vikings war chant, uniting the people of the nation.
It's a battle cry for all Vikings, striking fear into our enemies.
We share this tradition with you.
Our brothers and sisters, the Vikings of Minnesota.
From one Viking to another, it's time to come together.
From one Viking.
From one Viking.
From one Viking to another, Skål!
Skål, Vikings! Skål!
And I just have to say, as a Minnesota Vikings fan, no matter how many times, and I use this in my classes, no matter how many times I watch that video, I like just swell with Vikings pride, and I'm thinking, yeah, Skål. And so it's a really awesome moment though, because it took this thing that I thought was cool that another sports folk group had already had established through their traditions, and they shared it with the Minnesota Vikings through that common bond of Viking lore. And it was really exciting, and you see how folk groups then interact. Now, you might not be part of the Minnesota Vikings folk group. It's very likely that you're not part of that. So you might be thinking, you might have a less excited reaction than I do to that video, because it's not part of your folklore. It's not part of the things that you have an interest in. But you might be a sports fan. And you might be somebody who is familiar with your own team's traditions. So the Chicago Bears, for instance, have Bear Down Chicago Bears, which when I've gone to Chicago Bears and Vikings games where the Vikings always lost, I grew to dislike that little song and dance because it meant that the Chicago Bears were doing something well, and I wanted the Vikings to win. The Chicago Cubs have their earworm song, Go Cubs Go, that when I made that slide, the song was in my head for hours after that. The New Orleans Saints has Who Dat Nation. When I moved to Louisiana, I didn't actually know that the Saints had a name for their fan base until I was making friends and had making Facebook friends and seeing on Sundays in all caps, Who Dat? And I was like, what is that? Oh, the Saints are playing, and that's what's happening there. So I want to give you guys a chance to maybe chime in if there's any sports fans, if there are traditions or chants or fight songs that you guys are familiar with from your own teams or your own sports groups. I want to give a little bit of space for y'all to chime in if you have if anything's coming to mind.
Well, I'll jump in and oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, since Cassie can't see the chat, I was going to read out some of the chat messages that were coming in while you were talking about the sports there. Kara said, did I just become a Vikings fan? Sam 6 responded, go Bears. Bobby says, haha. Sam 8 says, go Vikings, previous season ticket holder. And then Amanda says, ILL for any former Illini. Sam 10 mentions Chelsea Dagger with the Blackhawks. Yes, that song is very synonymous with the Blackhawks now.
Amazing. Yeah, there's so many things that come to your mind. Even if you're not a part of the examples that I just showed with the Vikings, which if that bird's a Minnesota Vikings fan, yes, please. But if you have your own way of relating to that folklore, to that example, You might not be a sports fan though. You might be sitting back thinking, I mean, I'm not really that interested in sports at all. And so you're looking around and you're thinking, well, okay, I see that there's folklore, there's some kind of communication, folk groups get along, but you're still interacting with those folk groups through your responses. Your response might be indifference. Your response might be, why do you care so much? I was talking to my sister yesterday, and she was mentioning a friend of hers who has all these rituals for Packers games. And he's got to sit in the same spot and he can't move. He has to have his hat on backwards, but his fiance likes to watch the games but doesn't quite understand the rituals. And so you see those patterns of behavior from differing areas of life coming together, and you're interacting with those folk groups, and the ways in which they communicate and they behave. And we belong to a ton of different folk groups throughout our lives. We enter into folk groups when we're born, and we don't have that much choice in it. I have 2 older sisters that I grew up with. And I didn't have a whole lot of choice in the matter. Genetics made that choice for me, for my sibling folk group. And we have some folk groups that we choose to join. So I have made friends in the different places that I've lived and the different schools that I've gone to. And you meet and you bond over shared interests or shared values or any common factor that brings you together, and you form a folk group. And folk groups can be as small as 2 people to as large as an entire nation of people. I mean, the Iceland football team, part of the folk group's values in there is national pride, right? And so folk groups can be as small as 2 people or as large as an entire country. So what kinds of things do folk groups share? Well, we saw some of the rituals with the Minnesota Vikings and some of the team lore that gets shared. But folk groups also, they share experiences, and those things might get represented in different ways. They might get represented in the form of a memory quilt. So this is a quilt that I have that's made out of t-shirts that me and my friends made when we were in high school and moving into our early college years. Every time a Harry Potter movie or book was released, or a Lord of the Rings film was released, there would be a midnight release party for it. We would go to Barnes & Noble, or we'd go to the movie theater and see the movie, or be really excited at Barnes & Noble. There's a really excited atmosphere in those events. And our tradition for that was to create t-shirts for it. Some people wore costumes, other people wore t-shirts. And we would get together in my friend's basement and make a specific shirt for each of us for every single release. And as my t-shirts got worn into oblivion, I cut them up and had a friend create a memory quilt for me so that I have that representation of those traditions that we had at that time, and then of that folk group. I look at that quilt and I remember my friends that I made that with. Other things that might be represented by your folk groups, that the experiences that you share, are travel mascots. So these are some travel mascots that a few of us had on our study abroad trip to Oxford. I actually still have the dragon travel mascot. And we have pictures from our travels that with those things. And so this object represents that study abroad trip, and it's followed me along the way. You might have travel souvenirs or other objects that represent experiences you've shared with your folk groups. I have a t-shirt that I framed a t-shirt that I bought from the Globe Theater. And then I have a Tyrannosaurus Rex that me and my friends in Wisconsin, we just had a day and we decided to paint silly statues. And so every time I look at that T-Rex that I have, I think about that folk group that I'm a part of. And you also might be able to have some yearbook signatures that remind you of specific folk groups. This is my 6th grade yearbook. And I unearthed this while I was cleaning out one of my bedroom at my mom's house. And I looked at it and I went, potassium? Is that my nickname? And I texted my friend Sarah. I said, do you remember when we had nicknames with potassium and calcium? We have no memory of it, but we have this yearbook signature that records that dynamic, that relationship that we had at that time. So those are some examples of lore that can get preserved in various ways, those objects that become representative of something larger than themselves. So what is that lore that folk groups share? Well, the folklorist Lynn McNeil, she states that lore is the creative stuff that everybody is capable of producing. It's the types of artistic, expressive cultural production that everyone is capable of engaging in. And so what she mentions and what she talks about in this TED Talk is that we're not all capable of creating grand masterpieces, or we're not all capable of creating a hit album like Abbey Road, but we are all capable of visiting Abbey Road and leaving our mark on it and putting graffiti at the sites. We might recreate the album cover by drawing some lizard creatures, or we might just write on the wall, I don't like the Beatles, but I'm here. We're able to create that kind of creative stuff. That's what she's referring to. And there's a wall at Abbey Road that is full of these kinds of graffiti, of people leaving their mark at this musical landmark that's very popular. And there's people who try and recreate the picture. There's people who write silly things like Ringo smells. And so the lore that folk groups share, that creative stuff that everybody is capable of producing, this wall ends up becoming like a gallery of things that we can study and to see the types of people that have visited this site. We can learn about people's relationship to the Beatles. We can learn about their relationship to music in general. People might leave political messages on the wall. People might leave messages about where they come from. And so this becomes this creative expression that people put on a tourist landmark like this, becomes something that's almost like visiting a museum. When I was there, I was looking at it and studying it in the same manner that I would have been studying things at museums that I've gone to. And the other thing that gets created that is out there is just a treasure trove of pictures of people recreating Abbey Road, the album cover. You can see the picture in the bottom left. They're trying to recreate the album cover, but a taxi is ruining their moment, or the taxi driver is maybe thinking that the tourists are ruining his moment. But this is the stuff that we are all capable of producing. And so what happens when we bring these two terms together? What is folklore? The definition that I use is from the textbook Living Folklore, and folklore is informally learned, unofficial knowledge about the world, ourselves, our communities, our beliefs, our cultures, and our traditions that is expressed creatively through words, music, customs, actions, behaviors, and materials. So it's kind of a mouthful. So we'll start with the first part of it. Folklore is informally learned, unofficial knowledge about the world, ourselves, our communities, etc. So what that's referring to is it's thinking about the kind of stuff that we learn outside of our formal institutions, outside of those of the school, the formal school structure, or things like it. One way you can think about this is the distinction between what you learned in driver's ed versus what you learned through word of mouth or through observation. And so a question for everybody is, what is the speed limit if you were driving on a road and it says 55 miles an hour? What are you allowed to actually drive?
Are there cops around?
That's important. So if you're on a highway and it's open road and you can't see anybody.
Safely 65 miles an hour, 64 miles an hour, if you want to play it safe. because they're not going to waste their time pulling you over for 9 miles over. This has been tested quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I always go 4 miles over.
4 miles over. Others? Does the rule vary depending on where you're at? So what if you're in a school, if you're in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, does it apply?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, 34 miles an hour, that's, 30. That's my 30.
34 is your 30. I love that.
If it's a school zone, then I don't do the 9 miles, then I'll do the 4 miles over. If there's children, I will actually go the speed limit because I'm not a monster.
So there's, and the driver's ed teacher isn't sitting there going, 34 is 30, or 64, you're just going to get a warning. Like, that's not what the driver's ed teacher is technically teaching you. We learn that stuff through word of mouth. We learn that stuff just through being people that live in the world who like to tweak the rules. So that's the informally learned unofficial knowledge about the world, the society that we live in. And so the second part of this, that is expressed creatively through words, music, customs, actions, behaviors, and materials. This is an example of creative expression that refers to that stuff that's informally learned, that we know through word of mouth. The Keanu Reeves meme when he's just looking shocked. What if the government made the speed limit 5 miles per hour lower because they knew we would speed that much over it? It's a conspiracy theory. They know us so well that we're going to try and push the boundaries of the rule itself. That's an example of the creative expression that refers to that. So folklore is creative cultural expression about the things that we learn informally about the world that we live in. The other part of this the definition that I use is folklore is also the interactive dynamic process of creating, communicating, and performing as we share that knowledge with other people. And so that relates back to what Lynn McNeil has to say about lore itself, is that it's the stuff that everyone's capable of producing. So everybody's capable of creating a meme about the rules of the road. Me literally driving the speed limit and the car behind me. So you literally driving the speed limit is breaking that unspoken or that unofficial rule about how fast you're actually able to go on the road. When I go back to Illinois to visit my family, like in Louisiana, I usually only go 5 miles an hour over, and then I'm driving in the Chicago suburbs and I'm wondering, why is everybody passing me? I don't understand. Oh, because I'm supposed to be going at least 10 miles over in the Chicago suburbs, and I'm being the one that's literally driving the speed limit and doing it wrong. So I have to remember what my unofficial rules are on the road based on which region I'm actually driving in. So that's the kind of things, that's the definition of folklore, that creative cultural expression that surrounds the informal, unofficial things about ourselves, about the folk groups that we're a part of, about the culture that we live in, all of those things. So how do we identify folklore? That's a question that my students ask me a lot. Sometimes they'll ask me about a specific thing. Well, does this count as folklore? And I give them a list of characteristics of how we know something is folklore. But the way that we can kind of identify as a thing as folklore is how it's transmitted, how it's spread. It's folklore if it's passed on via person-to-person transmission, creating multiple versions in which we recognize conservative elements, things that remain consistent. And if those multiple versions are dynamic and variable, with details changing to fit new contexts and new tellers. So what that's referring to the way in which we spread our lore from person to person, through word of mouth, through observation, or through the internet. And because of the way that it's spread, anybody can create folklore. Everybody is creating folklore. And so we are constantly, because of that, folklore is constantly evolving. This is why we grow up hearing legends that sound really similar to a legend somebody else heard when they were growing up. So an example of a legend that I heard growing up was a ghost story, a hitchhiking ghost story, the Phantom Lady of Kennedy Hill, or the Ghost of Kennedy Hill Road. And the version of that legend that I heard was that there was a girl who ran away from home, and she was walking along Kennedy Hill Road at night, and it was winter, and that's a very, in that region of Byron, it's a very dangerous stretch of road. So she got hit by a car, she died, and now she wanders along Kennedy Hill Road, and people see her in the wintertime especially. But there's other versions of that ghost story that people in the region itself has heard. So does anybody out there who maybe grew up near Byron or the Rockford area have a different version or different details of the ghost of Kennedy Hill Road?
I always thought that's where Kennedy was shot.
The childlike assumptions. Kennedy Hill Road, yes, that makes sense.
I heard.
And I was very embarrassing age when I realized that wasn't the case.
So you didn't hear that ghost story. You heard a different idea.
See,
No, unrelated to the ghost. It was where Kennedy was shot and the ghost was just there.
I heard somebody else talking.
Yeah, I heard, well, our version that I always heard was it was like her and her boyfriend or whatever were driving on prom night to go to prom, and they got in a car accident, and then she died, and she's always wandering around in her prom dress, like waiting to, go to the prom or something.
You have a very different version than what I heard.
Yeah,
And that's exactly what this is referring to. We recognize conservative elements, those things that remain consistent. So we both knew that there's a ghost on Kennedy Hill Road, but there's different versions of that story. I heard my version, and then you had your version. Are there other versions that anybody heard?
In the chat, we have somebody that said they heard it was a woman who suffered from mental illness and wandered about the road. And then Becky commented that it's very much like the Resurrection Mary in the Chicago area.
Oh, tell me more about that. That was going to be my next question. Did anybody hear a ghost story in a different region that sounds similar?
Well, Resurrection Mary is based on the Resurrection Cemetery in the Chicago area, and I forget where. But everybody's, stories have said that they see a girl standing outside the gates of the cemetery, wearing a white dress, and she asks them to either like take her home or take her to her boyfriend. And it comes out, she died in an accident of somehow and is kind of like waiting. And apparently they also sometimes see her inside the cemetery, and like there's like a couple bars of the fence that are like bent outward, like somebody's trying to pry it open. So yeah, cemetery was one of those cemetery things.
And I'm sure people go and visit that cemetery a lot to kind of test if the legend is true. And that's absolutely, and so folklore, those legends, they exist in multiple versions just in the area that they're told. But as Becky has illustrated, we see and hear different versions that sound so much alike, even though Chicago is 100 miles away from Byron, right? And we get hitchhiking ghost stories that are told thousands of miles away from Byron. And so this is when we can identify something as folklore, when it's passed on via that person-to-person transmission, and it's creating multiple versions, but you're still look at it and you think, that sounds a lot like this other ghost story that I've heard. That's the traditional and dynamic elements of folklore. And that's one of the key things that I'll ask my students is, does it have traditional and dynamic elements? And the way, especially in Louisiana, one thing that my students often will end up talking about is food, because food can be folklore. And so there's a good illustration, a further illustration of traditional and dynamic elements of folklore is specific dishes that are traditional, like gumbo, or like chili. I really only want to eat my mom's chili. Everybody else's chili, or my brother-in-law has managed to make me accept another version of chili, but I still kind of prefer my mom's chili. But those traditional dishes that have these specific conservative elements, traditional elements that make it the thing that you can call gumbo, or make it the thing that you can call chili, or that you can call macaroni salad. But things change from recipe to recipe. So is there something that you absolutely have to put in for my Midwesterners? Is there something that has to go into chili? Otherwise it is not chili.
Beans.
Beans, yes, that was exactly the thing that I was thinking about, because I have a friend who doesn't put beans in her chili, and a debate erupted out of it. That's not chili, that's meat sauce. And that's a perfect version. It's a perfect illustration of the debates that can happen based on the dynamic elements. Does anybody else have any kind of traditional foods that they feel attached to that? No, you have to cook it this way, or no, this thing makes it the dish.
Someone in the chat, I believe, said it must be served with cheese and macaroni noodles, which just sounds insane to me.
Chili with cheese and macaroni noodles.
I think it sounds delicious.
Macaroni noodles. Ugh, I would just serve it with like oyster crackers, sour cream, and cheese.
Yeah, oyster crackers. That's something that is like a staple of chili. You can't just use saltines. You got to use oyster crackers.
Lots of cheese and different kinds of. There's Fritos. I'm a Frito person, and different kinds of something texture. Add some texture.
Yes.
Bay leaves and spaghetti sauce.
Now, for anybody in Louisiana or anybody who's familiar with the gumbo debate, I have so much fun with my students talking about gumbo, because the only thing that I've gotten them to consistently agree on with gumbo is gumbo has to have a roux. And it all kind of falls apart from there. And they disagree on, well, it's got to be this kind of protein, or you can't put tomatoes in it. And then somebody else chimes in, no, you can put tomatoes in it. And that is a dish that is very important to people in the way that we think about in the fall, you see statuses, oh, it's chilly weather. Down here, it's gumbo weather. And so it's a nice illustration, a further illustration of the dynamic and variable elements of folklore, or the dynamic and traditional elements of folklore. And so that's the type of stuff that you can look for when you are identifying whether or not the thing is folklore. Because not everything is folklore. Sometimes it can sound like everything is folklore, but not everything is folklore. There is a set definition. And one of the ways we can identify it is through how it's transmitted, through how it's spread. And memes are another good way of thinking about this concept. And there was the famous meme at the beginning of the year in the presidential inauguration of Bernie Sanders mittens. And so you have what blew up in that moment was Bernie Sanders turned into a meme. And so because everybody is capable of creating folklore, everyone is capable of this type of creative expression, everyone's capable of creating a Bernie Sanders meme. So I am once again asking that you not talk to me at parties. This could have been an email. Bernie dressed like the inauguration is on his to-do list today, but ain't his whole day. And one of my personal favorites, your Uncle Bernie stepped out to the bodega for a cream cheese and lox bagel and got trapped at an inauguration. So you can see these are all Bernie Sanders memes from the inauguration, but they have elements that change through it. We recognize it as, oh, that's Bernie at the inauguration, that's a meme. And then we have other versions that feature Bernie and historical moments like the moon landing. We have Bernie in iconic photos that he gets inserted into. And we have Bernie appearing in pop culture. And so this is how you can identify something as folklore. But the next step that you might want to take as you embark into folklore studies is questions that you might ask so that you can learn more about the lore that's being spread. And so a question a folklorist might ask about Bernie Sanders memes from the inauguration is, why was Bernie so meme-worthy in this moment? What about his demeanor, what about his attire made him such so worthy of being made into a meme. And one way to go about doing that might be to think about, okay, so well, let's think about the inauguration overall. Let's think about Bernie versus everybody else who was at the inauguration. You can see him in the bottom part of that photo. So what about Bernie was meme worthy in this moment? I'm going to throw that out to you guys. What about him made him a meme?
His facial expressions, the way he was dressed, and yeah, just he killed that. I mean, that was great.
What about his facial expressions? What about his facial expressions stood out against, say, everything else that was happening?
He was unimpressed.
Unimpressed. Unimpressed by what?
By the pomp, the circumstance, the status of the events.
Mm-hmm.
It was like he was there. It was a job for him. Like this was just another day. This was like just another meeting for him, a thing that he had to do as part of his job as a senator.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all of us. It was all of us at a stupid work event.
Yes, and a very formal work event, right? And so one of the things that we learn through studying folklore is we learn about people. We learn about the things that they value. We learn about about the way that they operate. And one thing we may have learned about this, or bring to mind, is the idea of formal events, formal work events, and how we are supposed to be dressed and how we're supposed to look and all these things. And as you mentioned, Bernie looks like he's just doing his job. He's at another stupid work event. And then we can relate to that. And we related in this instance with just joy and delight because we felt close to him. Nobody wants to follow that formal work event stuff, right? And so he became a meme because he looked like he was bucking that tradition, that value of ours. And there might be other things that get revealed by studying Bernie Sanders memes. A folklorist might see something different expressed by a group of Bernie Sanders memes created by conservatives versus a group of Bernie Sanders memes created by so-called Bernie bros, right? Those things might express different ideas that would allow a folklorist to learn about those groups of people. And so that's what folklorists like to do. That's what folklorists try to do. They study folklore so that they can learn about people. And so that leads us to our final question of the night, which is, why is folklore important? Well, there's a lot of folklore that we come into contact with that we just don't understand, that confuses us. There's folklore that makes us upset. There's folklore that offends us. There's folklore that might make us angry. And there's folklore that we just might hate, right? Folklore helps us understand each other through studying folklore in more meaningful ways, even when what we're observing makes zero sense to our personal lifestyles or our existing repertoire of human experience, right? So that's what folklore allows us to do. It allows us to reach that deeper level of understanding. So you guys might remember a little thing called the Tide Pod Challenge, and I received a text today about a new challenge that is quite dangerous, apparently, where people are just eating dry protein powder. So the idea of the Tide Pod Challenge and the idea of these challenges in general might create a sense of horror or a sense of judgment, where people, the immediate knee-jerk reaction might be, that's so stupid, why would you do that? Or being concerned because people die doing these challenges, but they're not uncommon things. And a folklorist would think about that in a slightly different angle. They would ask the question, they would not ask the question, why would you do that? With judgment, they would say, now, why would they do that? Why would children especially be partaking in dangerous challenges? And so the way that I wrap my mind around certain things like YouTube challenges or other challenges that land kids in the ER or even end in death is my experiences growing up with my sisters and my cousins. And we got up to all manner of crazy things. And some of the milder things, we were throwing stuffed animals out of the second story window. I don't quite remember why. Me and my cousin pretended to be horses. We played pretend and grazed in the front yard. We put thumbtacks on the stairs so that we couldn't get in trouble for being loud. And our aunt did walk up those stairs that had the thumbtacks on them. We poured food down the laundry chute. We prank called the operator. We played this game that is not on, it's a dangerous game. We would play a game where we would bend over, one person would bend over and they would take deep breaths. And I'm wondering if anybody else did this game when they were kids. We would take deep breaths and then the rest of us, the other four, would push on our chest and then we pass out. And it was just a riot of a good time. We loved it. We did it for hours and it was hilarious. And as I grew up and I look back on that memory, I thought, that's so dangerous. Why were we doing that? But what a folklorist does, and this is what makes folklore really significant for what you can gain from building a strong foundation in folklore studies, is folklorists would think about the things, those dangerous things that teenagers do, or those very offensive rhymes that children will say sometimes. I have a list of rhymes in my head. I'm like, God, that's very offensive. Folklorists would study those things and they would think about, say with certain rhymes, what do those rhymes say about the society that, or the folk groups that those kids are growing up in, that they're learning to be a part of? What about being a kid makes them want to challenge the rules that they're learning to be a part of? What about being a kid makes them want to tempt fate and tempt death with these very dangerous challenges? There was a group of kids, there was a large group of kids in Byron at one point. They would put on all black clothes and jump in front of moving cars. A folklorist would be thinking about child folk groups or teen folk groups and what's getting revealed, what's under the surface of that, so that we can understand each other better. We can understand each other better through the folklore that we're studying. And my final example that I want to talk with you guys about is from the Super Bowl halftime show last year. And this was another meme-worthy moment that came out of that halftime show. So this moment in the halftime show it became an explosion of memes, not unlike with Bernie Sanders. I was watching Twitter and I was really, really excited watching Twitter because I was teaching folklore the next day and I was teaching the text and context of folklore. And I was just like, this is the best, because I got to use that example. So the text is the lore that's being expressed. It's the story, the heirloom, the gesture, it's the thing itself. And the context is the social factors that surround the text. It's the culture in which the text is occurring, when it's occurring, who's performing, the audience, the culture from which the audience is coming from, or from where the performer's coming from. And without the context, the text can become really confusing. The text can be lifeless, and people who don't understand the text because they lack the context might create memes to make it make more sense to them. So Shakira doing the tongue thing should be a meme and then we had things like this: Mom, stop teasing your brother, followed by the clip of Shakira doing her tongue thing. We had me trying to get the last peach out of the fruit cup. We had the turkey that got pardoned on Thanksgiving. All of these jokes about Shakira's so-called tongue thing. But then there was this other part of social media that was coming in, and it was revealing, it was educating about the context. Chiming in because I know everyone will be making jokes about this for days. This is a popular Arab tradition called Zagruda, used to express joy at celebrations. And so suddenly we have more context to understand what Shakira was doing in that moment. And Shakira has, in an interview with FaZe, mentions that she is a fusion. That's my persona. I'm a fusion between black and white, between pop and rock, between cultures, between my Lebanese father and my mother's Spanish blood, the Colombian folklore and Arab dance I love, and American music. And so when we have that context, you might think back to, okay, what gestures of celebration, what behaviors of joy exist in my own experience? What kind of customary lore do I have that expresses joy? In a sports event, you might see the wave. And if you don't have that as part of your customary lore, you might be confused. So that helps us put that into its context, its appropriate context. And without it, then you had these jokes that were coming in. And what became really great to see in the dialogue that was occurring surrounding the Super Bowl, Shakira's Zagruda, was that people were feeling seen in that moment. So you think about the number of times that you see your own lore expressed on large stages, or the times that you see things that make you weird, but then somebody else expresses it and you suddenly are really excited because you're represented by something. And so that became the Super Bowl moment of Shakira doing this Zagruda became so much more meaningful. And the way that you can get to the meaning, the deeper meaning of those things is through that grounding in folklore studies. That's what makes folklore so, so, so important. And so to return us to my students' wonderful reflection, folklore is the thread that holds us together. If we all experience folklore in various forms every single day, then we can make the effort to understand the role that folklore plays for people that are different than us, that we are suddenly able to understand each other in a much more profound way. Because if folklore can travel, then truly we can travel with it. So thank you for listening. We are almost at 8 o'clock, but if there are any maybe questions or comments, but thank you.
We had a couple questions earlier in the presentation regarding some of the things that you'd been talking about. If we want to go back to some of those.
Okay.
The first one was, what's your opinion on the updated term, the plural folks with an X, F-O-L-X? Do you have any opinions on that as a folklore expert?
I don't have an opinion one way or another. I'm wondering if that's an accent that's going on with it. I'm not too familiar with it, but I think an accent maybe popped in my head, but I don't really have an opinion one way or another about how people express themselves in that way. Oh, it's the gender inclusive version of folks. Interesting. That's wonderful. Then yes. Yeah, so I learned something today, which is fantastic. I learned that it's the gender inclusive version. Fantastic. Yes, thank you for that.
And then there was another question later. As folklore evolves and perhaps spreads beyond the originating folk group, can it pass into the world of myth?
The world of myth. So I mean, one of the things that we think about with myth, and I've had students say, you ruined me, the distinction between myths and legends. Something passing on into the world of myth, when I think of that term myth, a myth is something that is viewed as both sacred and true. So like the book of Genesis is a book of myths. And so as folklore evolves and perhaps spreads beyond the originating folk group, I wouldn't necessarily say it passes into the world of myth. It might evolve into a different version of itself. It might become archived as a piece of folklore that used to exist but is no longer relevant to the society that we live in, because folklore is constantly changing. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a myth, because a myth it's a story that's both sacred and true. So it falls into the realm of religious stories that we share. Were there any other questions or questions that I missed or? Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. I really appreciate you all coming. The number of folks present is fantastic, and you're welcome.